Section 48 of Gray's Anatomy, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. Anatomy of the Human Body, Part 2, by Henry Gray. Muscles and Fasciae of the Hand. 1F. The muscles and fasciae of the hand. The muscles of the hand are subdivided into three groups. 1. Those of the thumb, which occupy the radial side and produce the thenar eminence. 2. Those of the little finger, which occupy the ulnar side and give rise to the hypothenar eminence. 3. Those in the middle of the palm and between the metacarpal bones. Volar carpal ligament. Ligamentum carpi volare. The volar carpal ligament is the thickened band of the antebrachial fascia which extends from the radius to the ulna over the flexor tendons as they enter the wrist. Transverse carpal ligament. Ligamentum carpi transversum. Anterior annular ligament. The transverse carpal ligament is a strong fibrous band which arches over the carpus, converting the deep groove on the front of the carpal bones into a tunnel, through which the flexor tendons of the digits and the median nerve pass. It is attached medially to the pisiform and the hamulus of the hamate bones, laterally to the tuberosity of the navicular, and to the medial part of the volar surface and the ridge of the greater multangula. It is continuous above with the volar carpal ligament, and below with the palmar aponeurosis. It is crossed by the ulnar vessels and nerve, and the cutaneous branches of the median and ulnar nerves. At its lateral end is the tendon of the flexor carpi radialis, which lies in the groove on the greater multangula between the attachments of the ligament to the bone. On its volar surface, the tendons of the palmaris longus and flexor carpi ulnaris are partially inserted. Below it gives origin to the short muscles of the thumb and little finger. The mucous sheaths of the tendons on the front of the wrist. Two sheaths envelop the tendons as they pass beneath the transverse carpal ligament, one for the flexores digitorum, sublimis and profundis, and the other for the flexor pollicis longus. They extend into the forearm for about 2.5 cm above the transverse carpal ligament, and occasionally communicate with each other under the ligament. The sheath which surrounds the flexores digitorum extends downward about halfway along the metacarpal bones, where it ends in blind diverticula around the tendons to the index, middle, and ring fingers. It is prolonged on the tendons to the little finger and usually communicates with the mucous sheath of these tendons. The sheath of the tendon of the flexor pollicis longus is continued along the thumb as far as the insertion of the tendon. The mucous sheaths enveloping the terminal parts of the tendons of the flexores digitorum have been described on page 449. Dorsal carpal ligament. Ligamentum carpi dorsali. Posterior annular ligament. The dorsal carpal ligament is a strong fibrous band extending obliquely downward and medialward across the back of the wrist, and consisting of part of the deep fascia of the back of the forearm, strengthened by the addition of some transverse fibres. It is attached medially to the styloid process of the ulna and to the triangular and pisiform bones, laterally to the lateral margin of the radius, and, in its passage across the wrist, to the ridges on the dorsal surface of the radius. The mucous sheaths of the tendons on the back of the wrist. Between the dorsal carpal ligament and the bones 6 compartments are formed for the passage of tendons, each compartment having a separate mucous sheath. One is found in each of the following positions. 1. On the lateral side of the styloid process, for the tendons of the abductor pollicis longus and the extensor pollicis brevis. 2. Behind the styloid process, for the tendons of the extensores carpi radialis longus and brevis. 3. About the middle of the dorsal surface of the radius, for the tendon of the extensor pollicis longus. 4. To the medial side of the latter, for the tendons of the extensor digitorum communis and extensor indicis proprius. 5. Opposite the interval between the radius and ulna, for the extensor digiti quinti proprius. 6. Between the head and styloid process of the ulna, for the tendon of the extensor carpi ulnaris. The sheaths lining these compartments extend from above the dorsal carpal ligament. Those for the tendons of abductor pollicis longus, extensor brevis pollicis, extensoris carpi radialis, and extensor carpi ulnaris stop immediately proximal to the bases of the metacarpal bones, while the sheaths for extensor communis digitorum, extensor indicis proprius, and extensor digiti quinti proprius are prolonged to the junction of the proximal and intermediate thirds of the metacarpus. Palmar aponeurosis, aponeurosis palmaris, palmar fascia. The palmar aponeurosis invests the muscles of the palm, and consists of central, lateral, and medial portions. The central portion occupies the middle of the palm, is triangular in shape, and of great strength and thickness. Its apex is continuous with the lower margin of the transverse carpal ligament, and receives the expanded tendon of the palmaris longus. Its base divides below into 4 slips, one for each finger. Each slip gives off superficial fibres to the skin of the palm and finger, those to the palm joining the skin at the furrow corresponding to the metacarpophalangeal articulations, and those to the fingers passing into the skin at the transverse fold at the bases of the fingers. The deeper part of each slip subdivides into 2 processes, which are inserted into the fibrous sheaths of the flexor tendons. From the sides of these processes offsets are attached to the transverse metacarpal ligament. By this arrangement short channels are formed on the front of the heads of the metacarpal bones. Through these the flexor tendons pass. The intervals between the 4 slips transmit the digital vessels and nerves, and the tendons of the lumbricalis. At the points of division into the slips mentioned, numerous strong transverse fasciculi bind the separate processes together. The central part of the palmar aponeurosis is intimately bound to the integument by dense fibroareolar tissue forming the superficial palmar fascia, and gives origin by its medial margin to the palmaris brevis. It covers the superficial volar arch, the tendons of the flexor muscles, and the branches of the median and ulnar nerves, and on either side it gives off a septum, which is continuous with the interosseous aponeurosis, and separates the intermediate from the collateral groups of muscles. The lateral and medial portions of the palmar aponeurosis are thin, fibrous layers which cover, on the radial side, the muscles of the ball of the thumb, and on the ulnar side, the muscles of the little finger. They are continuous with the central portion and with the fascia on the dorsum of the hand. The superficial transverse ligament of the fingers is a thin band of transverse fasciculi. It stretches across the roots of the 4 fingers, and is closely attached to the skin of the clefts, and medially to the 5th metacarpal bone, forming a sort of rudimentary web. Beneath it the digital vessels and nerves pass to their destinations. The lateral volar muscles. Abductor pollicis brevis, flexor pollicis brevis, opponens pollicis, adductor pollicis obliquus, adductor pollicis transversus. The abductor pollicis brevis, abductor pollicis, is a thin, flat muscle, placed immediately beneath the integument. It arises from the transverse carpal ligament, the tuberosity of the navicular, and the ridge of the greater multangula, frequently by 2 distinct slips. Running lateralward and downward, it is inserted by a thin, flat tendon into the radial side of the base of the first phalanx of the thumb and the capsule of the metacarpophalangeal articulation. The opponens pollicis is a small, triangular muscle, placed beneath the preceding. It arises from the ridge on the greater multangula and from the transverse carpal ligament, passes downward and lateralward, and is inserted into the whole length of the metacarpal bone of the thumb on its radial side. The flexor pollicis brevis consists of 2 portions, lateral and medial. The lateral and more superficial portion arises from the lower border of the transverse carpal ligament and the lower part of the ridge on the greater multangular bone. It passes along the radial side of the tendon of the flexor pollicis longus and, becoming tendinous, is inserted into the radial side of the base of the first phalanx of the thumb. In its tendon of insertion there is a sesamoid bone. The medial and deeper portion of the muscle is very small, and arises from the ulnar side of the first metacarpal bone between the adductor pollicis obliquus and the lateral head of the first interosseous dorsalis, and is inserted into the ulnar side of the base of the first phalanx with the adductor pollicis obliquus. The medial part of the flexor brevis pollicis